how did you get to the Nobel Prize committee? Is it how is the selection?
I can tell about, yeah, okay. I can tell all about I can tell that's not secret. The procedures, how you enter, all about the way the Nobel Committee, Nobel Assembly, how they are working. So that I can tell now if you wish. Is that a good idea?
Yeah,
yep.
It's a great idea.
Okay, so we start with the Donnall Thomas. So Donnall Thomas, as you all know, he got the Nobel Prize together with Joseph Murray in 1990. And the reason that the Nobel Committee officially has presented is that he got it because he made cell transplantation to a clinical applicable method. And Joseph Murray, he made other organ transplantation in the same way. So that was why it was thought by the committee that to have these two was an excellent idea, and they got it together. So there was no room for having, that could have been one more person involved, because the maximum number of people that can get the Nobel Prize at 1 year are 3. So therefore, it was not possible to have one more player in organ transplantation or one more player in cell transplantation. So although I cannot tell about how we reason, I can just say that it ended up, as everybody knows, that one person got it for organ transplantation, one for cell transplantation, and the prize was divided. So one got half, and the other got half of the prize. And the prize was then around, it was 10 million crowns, and 10 million crowns is somewhat less than $1 million. So that's about how big it is. Now the procedure. So I'll come now to the procedure. So the Nobel Assembly was established according to Alfred Nobel's testimony. He said that the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine, as it is named, should be given by the Karolinska Institute. So the Karolinska Institute had to create a body at that time, that was in the early 1900s, a body that could execute his will. So that was how they formed the Nobel Assembly. It's called the Nobel Assembly, not the committee. They call it the Nobel Assembly. And the Nobel Assembly was made up by all professors in medicine at the Karolinska Institute, because at that time there were very few, you know. There were much less than 50. I don't know exactly how many there were in the beginning, but what was some 10 to 20 people. But then, of course, you know, with the professorship that, as I think in most other countries, you get more and more professors. And I would say today, be a little critical, it's a little too easy now to be professor at the Karolinska Institute. And when I became professor, I was one of the last who was really going through the whole process of applications and so forth. But just before the time that I entered the assembly, they changed the rules. So the assembly should be no more than 50 professors at the Karolinska Institute. So then there had to be an election procedure. And the election procedure was such that the assembly itself, those who were professors at that time, they elected a new professor, but the number should never be more than 50 in the assembly. So this was now the body that decided about the Nobel Prize. And everything was made by secret voting. So you didn't know how the other person, the other professor at your side was voting. It was secret, and it was done by small labels, you know, you wrote the name and then you cast your ballot. But of course, to have an assembly without specialists was not enough. So very early, the assembly created the Nobel Committee. And the reason was that the Nobel Committee should be like it is in many countries, a government and a parliament. And the assembly was like the parliament to take the decision, while the Nobel Committee became the governmental body. They made all the research about the nominees, and they also presented to the assembly their proposal. Okay. So eventually, the committee became the important body. It was very rare that the assembly would go against the committee. So as assembly then, by secret voting, elected 5 people to create the Nobel Committee, those who were going to work with the prize. They worked in the beginning of the spring until the October, when the prize was presented on the candidates. So how about these 5 people? They among themselves suggested a chairman, and then the assembly decided about the chairman that the committee wanted to have as a chairman. So 5 people was still very few. So every year, the committee suggests another 10 people to be associated with the committee. So they will be members for a year. And then these 15 people then work with the prize for that particular year. So how do they then get the nominees? Well, there is a procedure that you get invited. And who is invited? Well, by the will of Alfred Nobel, all professors in medicine or physiology in Swedish, Norwegian universities, actually it became eventually the Nordic universities, are allowed to nominate Nobel Prize candidate for the prize in physiology or medicine. But of course, this was not enough. So eventually, the committee developed a much broader way of being able to nominate. So they decided to invite from all countries, I would say, important universities to choose candidates that they wanted to have the Nobel Prize. So that means that most important universities, particularly in the United States and Europe, but also in China, Japan, and all over the world, they get invitations. And usually these invitations go to the deans or the chairman of the university. So I would say these places are not very effective, and frequently the invitations do not go down to those who really know about the candidates. So now there is another body that could propose, and that is previous Nobel laureates in medicine or in physiology. And in fact, I would say those are the most efficient people to propose candidates. It's very frequently previous Nobel laureates that propose other laureates for the particular year that you are working on. So that is, the previous candidates, they are very knowledgeable. I must say, I've read many of their proposals, and they are excellent, you know. And I would say most of the time when you give out the prize, you have had proposals for these persons by previous laureates. I cannot tell how many because I'm not allowed to do that. And for this year, I cannot tell who has done the proposal. But then, of course,
for how long are you a member of the assembly or the committee?
Yes, that's a good question. So in the assembly, the assembly. There you sit until you retire. So as soon as you are elected, you sit until you're retired. Then the rules for the committee has actually varied a little over the years. But when I was there, it was 3 + 3 years. You could be, but you had to be re-elected for the next 3 years. So it was maximum 6 years. But if you could have been elected to be an associate for 1 year, that was not counted. So in fact, I was sitting there for 10 years. So in the assembly, I was there. I entered the assembly and the committee at the same time, and then I was sitting until retired in both. But because I was associated in the beginning, and for that, all those years until I was a permanent member or a member for 3-year periods, it could add up. So for that reason, I was there for 10 years. So I was there from 1987 until 1997 when I formally retired. So that's how you can prepare the whole thing. Then, of course, we are retired members are in a way involved throughout their lives because they are invited to certain reunions with the present committee in the past and so forth. So I still have connections with the committee, but I'm not a formal person to give advice or select. Sometimes I can propose, but so that is still possible. But I'm not a member anymore. When you retire, you're not a formal member of the Nobel Committee nor of the Assembly, and you have to go. So of course, it's good to have a rotating system, so you don't sit there forever. Before, the secretary, who is very powerful, the secretary for both the Assembly and the Committee is the same secretary. He is very powerful because he keeps all the threads, And earlier, he could sit forever, but that was changed. So he can sit for 2 times 6 years, so that is 12 years. And I don't think it's changed now recently, but there are some changes that has gone on long after I left, and that is that there are more invitations to nominate. And that means that the number of nominations earlier was around 200 or 250 candidates, while now it has gone up to several hundred. So it's more difficult today to do the job. Then how is the job going on? That's also, I think, an interesting question. And it's going on that when you get all these nominees, and at my time it was around 200, maybe 250. Well, it turns out that maybe 50% or even more have been nominated before. So you have to be nominated. You have to be nominated for the particular year that you get the prize. You cannot get the prize if you are not nominated that year. You cannot be nominated because you were nominated the year before. So if you want to nominate for the prize, you have to do it repeatedly. So certain of those who nominated and were very anxious to have that particular person get the prize, they nominated years over and over again. And how did we handle that in the committee? Well, actually, in the beginning of the year, in February, when all the nominations have entered, the committee goes through all these nominations. And then you find that more than half of them have been nominated before. So there are always made a short note on each. The usual way is to, if you are certain this person should not have the prize, there are many nominations that are really not very good. You made what's called a protocol note, and that could be 10 lines or something like that, which ends up not a person for the prize. And maybe half of these persons that have been nominated already had a protocol note, and then you just went through and said, okay, this person is not actual, this person is not actual for the prize. So otherwise it would be hopeless with 250 nominations. So eventually, if there's a new one which the committee thinks we should work on, then they make a longer note. They say this is a preliminary investigation. Some of the committee members will be assigned to make a kind of short investigation if this person could be a candidate that really could get the prize. Then you have been a little more important in this way, and there's a bigger chance for you, you know. And then eventually there are nominees, those who have been nominated, that the committee thinks are really interesting for maybe a prize. And you select maybe 10, 15 every year to make what's called a special investigation. And that is assigned to, could be a member of the committee, but it could also be outside people that you invite to make an investigation about the person that has been nominated. And that person has to have secrecy, of course, agreements with the committee. So if you are an outsider that making special investigation, you really promise not to talk about it with anybody. You have to do your investigation in secret. You can, of course, use all possible channels, but you're not allowed to tell that you're doing it for the Nobel Committee or anything that would reveal that you work with this person.
And what is the investigation like? Can you talk about that? What?
Yeah, that is usually it is a 10-page or so investigation about the field, about the persons that have been involved in the field, attempt to sort out who has done what, and attempt to find out who was the brain for really coming to the result that they have come to. So it's a very deep investigation that's done. And most of the time, when these investigations come to the committee, which is done long before the decision. So if we start in February, these should be in more or less in the summer or at least in the beginning of the fall. So it's possible then to make another one, another special investigation by another person, because we want to have more views. And I would say that most of the time when you make a special investigation, the person or persons that are then investigated, they will not get the prize that year, because most of the time the Nobel Committee want to have more special investigations. And that means that the next year, most of the time these persons are nominated the following year as well. And if not, the Nobel Committee can propose themselves. So they can also bring up these people again and make new investigations. So most of the time, special investigations have been made several times before you eventually have a chance to get the prize. So how is then, when these special investigations have been made, how do you come to a decision? Well, the assembly and the committee, they have joint meeting repeatedly. So as soon as the committee has made, let's say 10 investigations, special investigations, there is a meeting with the Nobel Assembly. The chairman or somebody else has to present all the results to the assembly, and they test with the assembly. What do you think in the assembly? Have you any views? And maybe somebody bring up something that is of interest, or they don't do too much. They listen, and they might say in the assembly, okay, go ahead and make another investigation, or well, your proposal seems to be relatively good. You have here 5 candidates, 10 candidates in different fields. So try to make a little more specific what you think is the most hot type of group or person that should have the prize. And the committee goes back. They have listened to the assembly. They do some more job. And then there is another meeting. And then at the next last meeting in the fall of the year when the prize is giving, usually the committee has 1 or 2 groups to present to the assembly, but they should have a proposal for the one that they think is the best one. So most of the time they propose this group should have it this year. And if the assembly doesn't oppose to this, there are no one that tells, no, that's impossible, or this should be the other group, or something like that, then the committee goes back. They think they have made a good job, and at the day when they are going to present the winners, they think that the assembly will say yes. They're pretty sure about that, but you never know, you know, so it's a little tricky. So on the other day, now the last Monday, when the decision was taken, I can presume, I don't know now this, that there were perhaps 1 proposal in the morning to the assembly from the committee. And I assume they then said yes to that. Now, if the committee didn't have a clear proposal, they must have that, because if they have 2, the assembly has to choose. And, you know, it's presented at 11:30 the same day, so you don't have too much time. So actually, the committee must be very sure that in the earlier joint meetings, they have got a clear view of the assembly that they will say yes to their proposal. And most of the time, they have only 1 proposal for 1 group. Otherwise, it's too tricky. I have experienced a 2 proposal once, and I can tell you it was very tricky, but I will not tell about that. So that's how it can go. Most of the time, there's no problems. There is a joint view from the committee and the assembly suggests the proposal, and at 11:30 it's presented to the press and everything. And actually, before they present it to the press, the secretary tried to call up those who have got the prize, you know, before the media goes out with it. So, and that was what happened on the last Monday, that those who got the prize were called up, and I think they didn't manage to reach all 3, because there were 3 for the hepatitis C virus, and eventually they always get very shocked by having got the prize. I didn't know about it most of the time, or so, but sometimes it happens that the one who has got the prize says, oh, well, yes, I deserve it. I think I was the right one. So it varies, you know.
How was it in 1990? Was Thomas
well, you
right?
know, Don got it in the middle of the night because you know, because of the time lag, you know. In the morning, it's not yet morning in the United States, and he woke up and he was very happy about the prize. He was very surprised. Very surprised. So that was done, but he was very happy, of course, not to tell about his wife that Dottie, you know, Dottie was very happy, very happy. So that was how it was when he got the prize.
And in 1990, was there only 1 like suggestion from the committee which summarized the cell therapy?
That I'm not allowed to tell.
Okay.
That is a secret, because that I cannot tell. So that will not be allowed because that would be too much. Then I enter how the committee reasoned in the specific case, and that I am not allowed to do. So I can only say that when Thomas got the prize, it was a prize, and I think it was a very good prize. So that's how far I can come. Otherwise, I'd they would be very angry in the Nobel Assembly Committee.
we don't want that.
No.
How can you talk a little bit of your experience in 1990? How it went? Have you been surprised, or was it clearly that the Nobel Prize eventually came to be received by transplanters, or?
I think it was very well taken by transplanters. Of course, I was myself in the committee at that time, so I cannot talk about my own reactions or what I did or so forth. In fact, I think I was already the vice chairman, because I was vice chairman for more than 3 years, and then I was a chairman for 1 year in the committee. So it was during my time, so therefore I cannot talk about my own role at all. I can only say that Don came because you get in October you decide about the prize, but then the prize is given out at the 10th of December when it's always is done, and Don came with Dottie, in December, and he came a little earlier than it starts because he has to give a lecture for the Nobel Assembly and the Nobel Committee. In fact, for all people at the Karolinska Institute, so it's an open lecture, and Don gave a very good open lecture. It's written in a series of books where he talks about himself, he talks about his prize, and how he came to the prize. So there you can, in fact, read the whole history as he sees it. And I think Don was very happy and very surprised. He didn't think that you could get a Nobel Prize for having made a clinical method. He had seen all these prizes that could pinpoint a discovery. And that is more difficult in Don's case. It's more like a procedure that eventually will be clinically applicable, and that's very unusual in the history of the Nobel Prizes in physiology of medicine. So he was very surprised, but very happy. And then he came. He gave his lecture. It was a very good lecture, although he was relatively old at that time, and it was a very good lecture. And then there was a big festivities in the city hall and in the concert hall, first at the concert hall and then at the city hall. So you are moved from one place to the other for the dinner while the ceremony is in the concert hall in Stockholm. So a very wonderful thing. And then we trained before. So because I was presenting to the public Don's discoveries as well as Joseph Murray's in the concert hall where the king is present and all the important persons. So you train before how you walk, how you go, how you do. And Don, he's not that kind of person that likes that very much. And there is the secretary of the whole Nobel organization. It's called the Nobel Foundation. He was like a general, something like that, on how we would go there. And Don, he had to do all this, And then he said, why couldn't I go with Dottie? And, he was going to go with me, so he wasn't allowed to go with Dottie. And he said, I understand. And then when the ceremony then eventually the next day, Dottie was sitting on the front line, close to the princess and all of those. And she was very happy when Don eventually got the prize. So that was a nice ceremony that Don, I think, liked very much.
Yeah, actually, the lecture can be found as a video on the Nobel Prize website, and
yeah, that's right.
I would encourage everybody to watch that.
Right.
That's quite interesting, especially from our time, when we see that there is only like one Kaplan-Meier curve, and because now you see one slide with I don't know, dozens of curves and tables, and everything need to be put on one slide. And this lecture was in comparison to the presentations now really relaxing, calm.
Yeah. No, it was very good. I remember that lecture. And of course, the Nobel, it's a Nobel Foundation, has worked very much with these sites that you can see the video and all that. And I think that's great. In fact, they are lagging behind a lot, unfortunately. So you know, they have to now also talk about who is nominating, which persons are nominating. But they have come, I think they have coming to the 60s or something like that. They are not allowed to come, it must be 50 years, you know, of secrecy. So now they can work on 1970, but they are in the 1950s or something like that. So they are lagging behind. So, for example, you cannot yet see there who nominated Don Thomas. You will eventually be able to do that, but now you cannot do that because it's too early. So, but that's a very good. They are doing otherwise they are doing this Nobel Foundation are doing very well in this video. I think these sites that you can enter and look at.
And what do you think was your point of view, or what was the standing of bone marrow transplant in the 1990s? So was it, from your point of view, just to give a quick, like, what was it to be a transplanter and in 1990 when the Nobel Prize was given to?
I would say that in 1990, that was on the top of the bone marrow transplantation. You know, I'm of course thinking a lot on myeloma that were interesting, because at that time all these new drugs was not yet there. So bone marrow transplant, allogeneic bone marrow transplant, was extremely important. I mean, in 1990, autologous was also on the way, and for other disorders as well, for leukemia and so forth, it was extremely important. You cured people that you hadn't been able to cure before. I'm just taking the example of chronic myelocytic leukemia because, I mean, that was fabulous to see these patients that all had died before. Now they were cured. In fact, at the at the meeting at the Karolinska Institute only a couple of years ago, a patient came up to me, and I didn't remember the patient, of course, because we had many. And he said, Professor Gahrton, I was one of those with chronic myelocytic leukemia that I got a transplant. And I have been very well throughout. You know, this was now 30 years ago or something like that, or even more. And those patients are there. And before, you had never seen a patient with chronic myelocytic leukemia cured. So it's really, in 1990, we were on the top, I think, of stem cell and bone marrow transplantation. Of course, we are doing perhaps more now because it is more worldwide and so forth. But there is always debate in many, not the least myeloma, about the use, as you know, about allogeneic transplantation. Not many are doing it anymore. And I think in many other disorders, it will probably decline. Some disorders, it will increase probably. But the decline is coming with the new drugs that are doing very well. And of course you can, if we now think about CAR T and CAR NK might come, that is, of course, you can call it a type of transplantation, but that's not actually stem cell transplantation. It's utilizing an immune mechanism to kill the cancer. So I don't know. We will see how it develops. But in 1990, I think bone marrow transplantation was the method now to cure a lot of people, with particularly hematologic disorders, of course.
Okay. So
maybe that was why the prize went through. I am not sure,
yeah.
But that could be one of the reasons. I'm not talking about that, but of course, you know, that was very much, people accepted this prize very positively, very positively. So there have been other prizes that have been less accepted, I can tell you.
Okay.
This was very well accepted.
Yeah, I think maybe I don't know, when I look to my parents or friends who ask me, okay, what do you do? And I tell them the story about what stem cell transplantation is, etc. And what everybody really acknowledges and really needs to recognize and to capture at the first moment is the fact that you cure patients with that. And that is I think a thing that everybody really can relate to, but on the other hand they respect the complexity of the whole procedure. So it's when I first started at the ward as a nurse, so during the first years in medical school we need to work for 3 months as a nurse.
That's good. Is that right? Very
yeah,
good.
for 4 months as an internship to just try to understand how nursing is done, washing people, caring for people. And my first internship as a nurse was at the transplantation ward here in Hamburg. And
is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Because
that's really fine.
Yeah,
wonderful.
I've got a friend who lost her husband from acute myeloid leukemia on the ward, but she said to me that the whole team was very professional and etc. And I can learn a lot of things there. And I was after my first semester, so really early on, and I've never heard of allogeneic stem cell transplant before. And then I went there, and then I needed to calibrate the fact that people are cured from the disease, but they die from relapse, etc.
Right.
And that was at first really hard to understand, but on the other hand, really capturing. So it's
right.
Yeah.
No, when I started, you know, I was so fascinated about this. I mean, maybe that will come on Monday. I'll tell about that. But I was visiting Georges Mathé in Paris in 1971, 1970 maybe even. And then I went to Donnall Thomas. I visited him in 1972 to see what it was, because I was convinced we must start bone marrow transplantation because that cures patients. And this was after, as far as I remember, Donnall published this series of acute leukemias where he cured a fraction. So that was how I started, and I was really fascinating about this method that could do this, cure patients with these disorders where all were died, you know. Of course, in acute leukemia, there were already patients that were cured by chemotherapy, you know. But I visited also Tom Fry in Boston, and I had been working with Sidney Farber for 2 years. And of course, Sidney was very I mean, he didn't say that he cured the patients originally because they all relapsed, the first ones in 1940s. But I mean, he was a pioneer, absolutely. And there were people that were cured without bone marrow transplantation. But in acute myeloid leukemia, at least, most people died in the 1970s. And then they were cured by bone marrow transplantation. It was fantastic. It really was.
Yeah.
So it's bone marrow transplantation has an interesting story, really.
Yeah.
It's dramatic.
And so
it's easy for us in EBMT and bone marrow transplant to say that, but I think even patients, some of the patients, as I told you, I had a patient coming up there 30, 40 years later, thanking me for having cured her chronic myelocytic leukemia. It was fantastic.
Yeah. Do we want to come back on Monday with the story, with the history of BMT and your starting point, or would you like to talk a bit longer now? What do you think?
Yeah, well, if we take it now, maybe we don't need to meet till Monday, or
yeah.
What should we talk about? Otherwise, we have nothing to talk about on Monday.
Yeah.
But I can do it now. That's up to you. What do you think?
How I don't know what your timetable is for today.
Today I have as much time as you wish.
Okay.
Today is a very good day.
Then we
take the whole thing today. Why not?
We try everything to come as wide as we get, and then we see at the end.
Yeah. Okay.
So
now
maybe it's good to start now with the history and with your maybe how you came to bone marrow transplant, and
yes.
And try to, like, if you can mix it. Otherwise I'll just ask questions about it, like the history of BMT, how you came there, how you followed the experiments from Thomas, and especially maybe it's good to explain to people certain names. For instance, Sidney Farber, some people may know him, but maybe just if you talk about people, maybe just
where they are and what they do. Yeah. But that's a good idea. So I will start. Then I start with
how did you come to BMT? So you've been a medical student. You finished medical school, and then you started to work on the ward, or have you been in contact with transplant or with hematology oncology during medical school, or what was the way into the topic?
Yeah, good. Well, you know, I'm an old man, so when I went to medical school, you didn't have much to treat the severe hematologic disorders. Methotrexate and 6-mercaptopurine, those were the two drugs that were used for acute leukemia. For chronic myelocytic leukemia, it was busulfan. And of course, you prolonged the life of chronic myelocytic leukemia somewhat with these drugs. But that was how it was when I was in medical school. And in fact, when in the beginning of my career as a doctor, I entered the Department of Medicine in Lund for a couple of years because before I entered a theoretical type of, I was basic science doctor at a great guy, Torbjörn Kaspersson, who invented the banding technique for chromosomes. Actually, he was proposed for the Nobel Prize numerous times, and he never got it. That was my boss at the Karolinska Institute.
When was that?
This was in 1961. I went to him. So then I had 2 years of medicine. I was convinced I was going to be a hematologist, but I wanted to have basic science education, and I made my thesis with this guy, Torbjörn Kaspersson at the Karolinska Institute. And that was, my thesis was not very interesting. I used cytochemistry and I measured a lot of cells and so forth. And this method never came out to be very important, I must admit. Not until Kaspersson has made the banding technique. Then I was in the chromosome business. And we were very successful. You know, we discovered the first chromosomal abnormality in chronic lymphocytic leukemia. We missed the translocation in chronic myelocytic leukemia to Janet Rowley, who was in the United States and found this just before us. But she was in Stockholm and picked up the banding technique by Kaspersson, my boss, and cell biologist and very important in the Nobel Committee. And as I say, he should have had the Nobel Prize himself, but he never got it. So anyway, I worked with him for 5 years. And then I entered at the Karolinska Hospital. But in the meantime, in an exchange type of between Kaspersson and Sidney Farber. Sidney Farber was a big shot in the United States in cancer as a whole. And he created the National Cancer Institute. Actually, he went to Eisenhower and discussed with him. And then eventually, I wouldn't say he created it, but he was very important in creating the National Cancer Institute. And he worked with the lady Lasker, who invented the Lasker Prize. And they actually got money for cancer. And eventually, Sidney Farber, he built up what's now called the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. It was then called the Children's Cancer Research Foundation, with baseball players in Boston. And they got a lot of money, you know, to build up this enormous facility that then has, of course, expanded a lot after his death. He died in 1973. But I worked with him 1963 to 64, and in 1968 to 1969, and in exchange with the Karolinska Institute. So I had a very good position there. I could do whatever I liked. And I picked up the treatment idea of acute leukemia. He made the first treatment of a child with acute lymphoblastic leukemia in Boston. So of course I was caught by all this. But at that time, there were no transplants. Donnall had made his transplant in 1957. In fact, he had worked with Sidney Farber for a short time, but no one believed in it. No one. It was not talked about it even. So during my visits to Sidney Farber, no one talked about bone marrow transplantation. Even in 1969, my last year there, bone marrow transplantation was not a popular thing. It came slowly then. And in 1970, when I had left the United States, I started to pick up George Matthäus' ideas and Donnall Thomas' ideas and what he had done. And I was convinced that this would be a very important method eventually. I was really totally convinced about that. So when I came home, I started to think about how to develop this. So my first contact was George Matthäus in France, in Paris. He had worked with one of the great guys there, Claude Bernard, who was a god in France, and he was very well known in the United States. He worked a little together with the Americans, but then he stuck to France. He was very nationalistic, you know. And George Matthäus has worked with him, but they clashed. George Matthäus was a very, outspoken person. So he left Hôpital Saint-Louis in Paris, left Bernard, built up his own unit at Villejuif outside Paris. And there he was very, very good at engaging the press. And I got in contact with him. I was invited to him. I gave a lecture there, in fact. And we had
how did you get there? Did you write to him?
Well,
Or?
no, I wrote to him because, you know, he had treated, he has developed, I would say, immunotherapy of cancer. He gave children BCG in order to stimulate their immune defense. And he believed that to treat children or patients with acute leukemia with BCG, in addition to the cytotoxic drugs that were there, he could cure more patients. There were already cures at that time in children. So he was convinced about BCG, and he had made a randomized study with BCG. And I had read about that, and I thought, many people were not convinced, and I thought that there could be some, not fraud, but I didn't believe in Mattei totally. So I wrote to him. I said, could I go through your material? And George Mattei said, yes, you're welcome. And I came there, you know. I spent a couple of weeks there with him. I went through his material. It was perfectly all right. Those who had got BCG, they had fared better. It was a small material, but anyway, they had fared better. He had a scarification method that looked very bad until he made scarification and then put the BCG on the arm of the children. But anyway, it seemed that they had done better. I became a friend of George Mattei. I was invited there again, and in the 1970s, I came there and gave lectures about immunization. We had a program in Stockholm. And of course, he was happy about that. But then he had started bone marrow transplantation. And he showed me this case that he had done in 1963. He already called it an immunological method because that was his interest. And in fact, he had cured a patient with 1963 with acute myeloid leukemia. And as I said later, this patient died from graft versus host disease, which, of course, Donnall Thomas has pointed out. I don't think that Mattei and Donnall Thomas were very, very good friends. In fact, that cannot be said. But anyway, this was how I got in contact with bone marrow transplantation. But of course, Seattle was already the mecca of bone marrow transplantation. So when I went back for doing some more research with Sidney Farber in 1972, I went also to see Donnall Thomas. I had made up with him to see him. And he said, yes, you're welcome. Everybody says you're welcome when you write to them. So I looked at his bone marrow transplantation activities, and I was convinced this was the thing to do, you know.
So you took part in transplant itself and worked on the board, or?
No, I didn't work with Thomas at all.
Okay.
I didn't. I worked with Sidney Farber, but I didn't work with Thomas. I visited him. He showed me everything. I went around to all the people there for a couple of days. But what I saw convinced me that this was the thing to do. So I had seen both Mattei and I had seen Don when I was convinced that we had to start this in Sweden. Mm-hmm. So this was actually my background for going back home and then convincing people that fund this, get funding for doing bone marrow transplantation because, you know, it was expensive. So I was not the boss at that time. I was a young doctor and I didn't have a power to really decide about it. I had to find people that I could convince. So the one I convinced in Stockholm was actually an organ transplanter. He was called Carl Gustav Groth. And he became enthusiastic, you know, although it was not surgery. So I told him, would you like to launch this program with me? And he said, yes, of course, although it's not surgery. And then we had at Huddinge Hospital a very able immunologist, Erna Möller, who had been up at transplantation immunology laboratory. And this was, of course, crucial because we needed HLA typing and all that. So we made a team at Huddinge, me, Gösta Gahrton, and Erna Möller. And then we started to build up all the facilities that were needed. And of course, since we had an organ transplant unit, it was a really relatively easy start when I had him on board. Because, you know, organ transplantation, all its surgery, many things are similar still, except for the surgery. So we started like that, and then eventually we had a case of aplastic anemia, and that was a boy who was 70 years of age, you know, and he had had hundreds of transfusions, and he was in a very bad condition, you know, and that was our first transplant.
From sibling, or which?
It was a
donor?
sibling. It was a sibling. Yeah, it was an HLA compatible sibling donor. Mm-hmm. So that was the first one, and unfortunately, it was not successful. First, he engrafted, but he rejected. In fact, I don't know. We made probably something wrong, and he rejected anyway. So we made a second transplant. The second transplant, that was a good take. He was in the hospital for some weeks. And then he was really in good shape, and we was going to send him home. And then he got what we didn't know too much about at that time. He got the CMV infection, which many patients at that time, they got, you know, and there was no treatment. So he got the CMV pneumonia, and he died, in fact. So, you know, this was really a backlash. It was very difficult because it took us 2 years before we made the next transplant. Because of this, we hadn't succeeded. It was difficult to convince all the authorities to fund this. But eventually, we had another case of aplastic anemia. And that was a 51-year-old man. You know, at that time, we didn't have any age. We didn't know too much about what the age mean, you know. And he was not as bad as the boy, but he was in a bad condition because he didn't respond to anything. So he said, I want a bone marrow transplant. He was a very important person because he had been a champion in wrestles. And his brother was actually a world champion in wrestles. So they together, they said, well, we'll do this, you know. Eventually it was not, he had many brothers, so eventually it was not the brother who was a world champion, it was another brother who was also good in wrestles, who was a donor, an HLA compatible brother. So we made a transplant. It went perfectly, you know, everything went well. That was a good take, and he didn't have complications. He didn't have actually graft-versus-host disease. He eventually got a chronic graft-versus-host disease that troubled him somewhat, but he lived for many, many years, and we were on board, you know, and then we started the program. Then it all went very well.
And
so
during that time, what did you do when you saw patients with chronic or acute graft-versus-host disease? What kind of drugs did you have?
But of course, we made exactly as in Seattle. We had methotrexate prevention, and we used steroids when they had graft-versus-host disease. There was no other possibility, no other things that we used. It was long before mesenchymal stem cells and things like that in fact was developed at Huddinge. But that was other people, you know, that was Ulla Rindén and others that came into the group later on.
And what kind
But
of conditioning did you use for your first 2 transplants?
we used total body irradiation as I did in Seattle. So it was absolutely a copy of the Ken Gray, you know, with lung shielding. And so that was exactly the Seattle method. In fact, we had the telephone in hand for calling Seattle whenever it was needed, you know. So, and Don was very good. It was actually Rainer Storm in general who was the one who I talked with. You know, Rainer was in Stockholm several times, and we had a very good relation. We didn't have programs together, but you could call him and get advice, you know, and that was how we started. So Seattle was our line, was the telephone line at that time.
How was what was the time like between your first transplant and your second? Because you said there have been
So
two years. What was
Yeah.
it like? What kind of discussions did you have after your first?
Yeah, we actually were looking for a case that didn't in a plastic anemia. This was a plastic anemia at that time. We hadn't started with leukemias. So we were looking for a case that was not in such a bad condition as the first one, but still did not respond to the treatment. I mean, aplastic anemias didn't respond to treatment very well anyway, but he should be in a relatively good condition. That was the point. And we didn't find this patient until 1977. So it was close to 2 years before we made the second case. So we had only aplastic anemia to deal with, and we were very selective. So the patient had to be in a good condition, but still being looked upon as a case that could not be saved by other methods. You know, this was relatively tricky to find that case. So that was how we reasoned. So eventually it worked, but it took time, took too long time in my opinion. But we were very, you know, having not succeeded with the first, you have to be very careful. The press, you know, was always there because this first case, a world champion brother in wrestles, very outspoken. He wanted to tell everybody about that his brother was going to get a bone marrow transplant. And we, as doctors, we were a little hesitating, particularly in the beginning, when we didn't know how the outcome would be. But of course, we were very anxious that the press would be positive. So I was frequently in the newspapers and even in the television talking about this first case because the brother wanted that, and he himself also wanted that. You know, so he was well known. You know, he was called Svensson, and his brother was called Svensson. There was a usual common name in Sweden, but these two brothers in wrestles, they were well known in the Swedish public. You know. And so that was, and we liked to utilize the situation as bone marrow transplanters to have positive response from the public, and by that having positive response from the hospital, so that we were going to be funded. You know, that was a tricky play, I would say.
That but I think as well a pressure, because
absolutely.
If you would have failed, then
and you know, I don't know how it would have gone with our bone marrow transplant program, but I tried to do my best. And my friend called Gösta Gahrton, he also was very good at taking the press, you know. So we both worked from all sides, you know. I have old pictures in the newspapers, you know, how we go to rounds and how this guy is sitting in his bed, you know, looking very good after the bone marrow transplant with both brothers there, and so it was successful. It could have gone wrong. You have to be careful with the press, but there was no possibility for us not to be in the press because of the brothers, because they pushed the press, you know, and we had to more or less respond. So we were not, of course, we could not go to the press without them. And we didn't encourage them very much. But they thought that they were in something very special treatment, of course, that we have told them. So they wanted to go out and show the press.
And after that, the press was good and you got funded?
Yeah, very good. Very good. The press was very good after that. Very good.
Okay.
The press was always positive. So even when we came with new cases that wanted us to tell to the press was very positive. They were never negative. Not like the Macchiarini affair we have now, you know, the Macchiarini who tried to transplant plastic airways to patients. I don't know whether you have heard about it, but he's now on trial and things like that. It's a terrible story in Sweden.
Oh,
so
what happened
can go
there?
wrong. Macchiarini, you know, he was recruited by the Karolinska Institute to do transplants with plastic airlines, trachea, in patient, and he that's still going on. This it's called one of the largest scandals in the Karolinska Institute, because he selected patients that were not really in as bad a condition as he probably had told them. They were in a very bad condition. They needed a new throat. He was an absolutely super surgeon. The idea was not bad, in my opinion, but he operated plastic tracheas to patients. And the first patient survived, was much better, was published in Lancet. Lancet took it, an enormous group of people at the Karolinska Institute. It was a big story, you know. Eventually, this patient died after a year or something. And he died, it was said that he died after the publication. Then the investigation has shown that when they had the proofs, the patient died. And it was not said in the proofs that he had died, you know. That was terrible. And then it turned out that Macchiarini didn't have the ethical permits that he should have had from the beginning. And then he continued, of course, the transplants. He made 2 new other patients from abroad, but he made it at the Karolinska Institute, or Karolinska Hospital rather. It's 2 different bodies. And they also died. And then there was a lag of a couple of years before a journalist started to dig into this. And he found out that the patient had died, the patient was wrongly selected, they didn't have the enough ethical permission, the correct ethical permissions. He hadn't made the experimental trials that he should have done. And eventually, he's now tried for having killed 3 people. So it's a big story. It's still going on. You don't know where it will end up here. But he's not here anymore. He was an Italian, so he's not here anymore. He was recruited from Italy to Sweden because people in the Karolinska, we had so much stem cell research, you know, NK cell research, stem cell research, that he would be the clinician that would fit in here, you know. So doing this transplant, the interesting point in it, I thought was very, very interesting, was that he recruited people that were in the field of stem cell research, and he covered the plastic with cells that were the patient's own cells. And by that, stem cells. So by that, it should not be rejected. That was the idea. And one of my pupils, in fact, was the one who made the cells, and he's on the paper. I eventually managed to save him from being accused of not having done the right thing, because he was not a clinician, he didn't know anything about. And Macchiarini was on the top of his reputation from the rector of the Karolinska Institute. So I didn't think it was reasonable that he, in good faith, was on the paper, should have been able to see that there was no ethical permit, there was not all these, the patients were wrongly selected. How could he know? He thought that he was selected to be a big guy together with this Macchiarini by using his cells to cover the plastic tracheas that were then inoperated in patients. So it's a big story. It doesn't belong to this actually, but it's one of the scandals, and we never entered that with bone marrow transplantation.
But I think that's a good example for what young physicians and trainees are quite maybe sometimes scared of, or have at least a bit of respect. But I think it's important to understand that the procedures you started in the 60s, 70s, that the atmosphere when you start something new and you're a scientist, you try to understand what's going on. But in the early days, I suppose you didn't, and you knew that you didn't. And that pressure, how did you manage that? How is it just try to focus on the problem, or because you said you've been convinced from the beginning, so did that like save you from saying, okay, after that first patient, maybe we've gone too far?
I never thought in those directions. Of course, the regulations were not as strict at that time. Ethical committees started around that time, but utilizing a new method where there was experimental evidence that Thomas had in dogs. We hadn't done it ourselves, but made bone marrow transplantation already an acceptable method in Sweden, although you can discuss it, of course. So we didn't need ethical permission to make a transplant. So it was not looked upon at that time as an experimental method. At least it was poorly defined, but I made my own opinion about it. And my opinion was that we were allowed to do this in a patient that didn't have any other chance, because there were experimental evidence in both France and United States that this was an acceptable method. So I was not afraid, in fact, although we didn't succeed with the first patient. And of course, many people say that Donnall Thomas' first bone marrow transplants in cancer patients, in fact, he had only cancer patients that was considered to be non-curable and didn't have many months to go, and all of them died, in fact. That should have today been looked upon unethical. There are people that are saying that, and that bone marrow transplant would never have been possible with the present regulations by ethical committees, because there were no successes in the beginning. There were only principal successes and not successes in the mid-1950s. I don't know, but sometimes, of course, I don't oppose any of the regulations that you have today. You have to be very strict, you have to have ethical permissions and so forth. But sometimes the bureaucracy is very, very difficult, and it's very difficult to come to use new methods. But of course, I think it's right. It has to be like that. And looking upon Macchiarini affair that I talked about shows that yes, you should have strict rules, because otherwise it can slip away, you know.
Mm.
But I was not, to go back to your question, I was never afraid, or never, I didn't even think about that I could be accused of doing an unethical thing. I didn't even think in those lines, in those terms. I thought it was so obvious that here you can cure patients that are uncurable, although we didn't succeed because we selected maybe the wrong patient from the beginning. He was in too bad condition. So when we made the second case, I wasn't afraid at all. Not at all. But maybe I was lucky.
How did you go on after your second transplant? So what were the next steps in your...
Then we expanded. We made a plastic anemias. We very soon come to, well, not very soon. Not until the early 1980s, we started transplant leukemias. So it took a little while. But then the acute leukemia program started. We had successes, I would say, all the way. Of course, our patients have died, but we had the good cases that made publicity. I don't hide that at all, and we utilized it, and it was positive publicity all the time. So there was no investigation of why did patients die, because patients died in those who didn't respond, those who had chronic graft-versus-host disease or even acute graft-versus-host disease. But in the public, if you had leukemia, you were believed to have no chance. So if you cured one patient or two patients, and that there was good press about it, you could only win, actually. That was how it was at that time.
And your first acute myeloid leukemia patients, did you transplant them already in first complete remission, or?
Yeah, we did. We did not, because then other centers like even Hammersmith, Don, Paris, they had come to the conclusion that you should be in partial or an attempt to have remission before you did it. So we did it in remission. Of course, because of that, we had very good results. So we didn't, I reasoned, because I didn't want to come into this, that you transplant people that are very poor and 90% would die. So I had a philosophy. Maybe it was not absolutely correct, but I told parents or patients that were refractory or were in severe, more relapses, that wanted to have a transplant. I told them that it was not possible to have a successful outcome in that situation, because otherwise we would have transplanted patients and would have a 90% failure. And that's not possible. You know, the personnel cannot take it, but you cannot tell the patient, well, our personnel cannot take that 9 out of 10 patients will die. You have to tell them that it's not possible to have a successful outcome in this situation. So that was how we done, right or wrong. Maybe there would be 5 or 10% chance of having saved the patient, but we couldn't do it.
And the transplants were in the early 80s also only from siblings, matched siblings?
It was only siblings, yes, it was only siblings. It took quite a while before we started to do unrelated donors.
When did you start with that?
Yeah, well, I would try to remember, but I mean, we were well out in the 90s before we did
All right.
that. You know, eventually, I became president of the World Donor Organization, WMDA. And of course, that was in 2000. So then I was, of course, convinced that we could use unrelated donors. But we didn't start to use that before. It was in the 90s.
Okay. And during the 80s, so just to understand, until 1990, until the Nobel Prize, so your numbers just went up and you gathered experience from patient to patient, or have there been any important steps, experiences during that time until 1990?
Well, of course, we were very anxious to find new indications and to be in the front line. And now we come to myeloma, of course, because I would credit, in fact, one of my undergraduates, or the younger doctors, for the first transplant in multiple myeloma. She was called Berit Lönnqvist, and she was she was like a computer, you know. So she would take care of many of the patients that I've been credited for. Actually, she was the one who took care of those patients. And she was an anchor in bone marrow transplantation at my department. And she told me she had a patient with multiple myeloma. She had she also worked outside bone marrow transplantation. But she told me, this patient is refractory to all treatment. She has no chance to survive. And I'm sure that we could do a bone marrow transplantation in this myeloma patient. Oh, I said, well, you know, myeloma, that's the, has I been, I didn't know about any transplant in myeloma. and we looked at the literature. That was one done by a guy called Heiby. That was an ASCO presentation, I think. And then, of course, Don had done one with his first patients that died very quickly. So I was not convinced, you know, but eventually I succumbed to her proposal. And we did this bone marrow transplant in 1983. This is very early for myelomas. And there were parallel in Bologna. They in parallel made a few cases also. It was in fact Michele Cavo, that you might have heard about, in Bologna, was involved in those patients. And we made it in parallel. We didn't know about each other. And this patient, they went to complete remission. It was just fabulous. She had no problems. All myeloma disappeared totally. She was refractory before. And 1 year went on. She was still incomplete. 2 years and 3 years. And I said, now we have cured multiple myeloma. But before 4 years, she relapsed. So she got the myeloma back. But she lived for many years. And I'm absolutely sure she shouldn't have done that if we hadn't made a transplant. So that was how we tried to expand indications. And myeloma was then, after that, myeloma was my focus for transplantation, as you know. And we made several ones that went very well. And then, of course, I got to know about the Bologna cases. So when we first published our 3 patients, I think it was in 1986, with this first one included, Bologna at the same time published also a few cases. And Michele Cavo told me a couple of years ago, some years ago, that one of their first patients was still alive, some 30, 40 years later. So it's 30, maybe, yes, was in the 80s. So that was a real success in myeloma. But you know, it's not the same today, because myelomas do so well with other treatment methods today, and autologous together. But autologous is still there. And I think a few patients maybe should have an allogeneic transplant. So yes, we tried to expand indications. And then, I don't know if you know Olle Ringden, who was actually a surgeon from the beginning, but started to be very interested in bone marrow transplantation, stem cell transplantation. And he and Per Ljungman as well, they slowly entered this field, and they were the ones who then were driving this later on when I retired. So Olle Ringden made many important works in graft-versus-host disease prevention, and studied graft-versus-host disease. And he was the one who came up with mesenchymal stem cells together with Katharina Leblanc, and made the first attempts to treat severe graft-versus-host disease with mesenchymal stem cells. And I don't know how it's now, it's still debated, I suppose. But that was one of the key things that were done at our center.
How did you manage in the 80s with increasing numbers? How did you manage the complications? So you said, I think Donnall Thomas said in his presentation at the Nobel Prize that the mortality rate from cytomegalovirus pneumonia was at that time about 80 to 90%. So what did you do when you had the complications after transplant?
Yeah, that is really good question. Of course, I mean the viral treatment of antiviral treatment, of course, developed very much during that time. You know, I'm not the expert on this. It was Per Ljungman actually who took over this, and he has been an expert in CMV particularly. And I don't know exactly the reasons for the diminishing complication rate, but the antiviral drugs were obviously one reason. The better prevention of graft-versus-host disease when cyclosporin came was, of course, very important also. And then, of course, all other kind of antibacterial drugs being more efficiently used was probably one reason, because complications diminished drastically. That is for sure. And I cannot pinpoint one single thing that was the most important ones. Those who dealt more with it should be more qualified to tell about that, particularly Per Ljungman, who's an expert in it. But it did. We had better and better results, less and less complication. But in my opinion, of course, chronic graft-versus-host disease is still a big problem, no doubt. Not the least in multiple myeloma. That's probably one of the reasons that we don't get better results there, that we don't cope well enough with chronic graft-versus-host disease. It's still a very difficult problem when you have it. It's not so many patients that have severe chronic graft-versus-host disease, but too many, no doubt.
And the issue with conditioning, how did you do that? How did you manage? Because nowadays we have like all these types of conditioning, less intensive, myeloablative. But at that time, I think there were only 4 to 5 conditioning regimens.
Yeah, you know, it was busulfan or it was total body irradiation. Those were actually the 2 ways of doing it. And we used total body irradiation for practically all the time. We then started with busulfan, and that was particularly Ringden who was interested in busulfan conditioning. But other conditionings, there was no conditioning that was particularly better. Of course, the non-myeloablative and reduced conditioning was very important for multiple myeloma, particularly when you combined it with autologous transplants. So there were all these types of variations of conditioning. And then we, as you might know, we used, as was done by Hermann Einzel, and I don't know whether you were involved in treosulfan use. Treosulfan, I think, is a very good conditioning, but that came much later, and that's what we do very frequently now, particularly in the myeloma patient, the few that we give an allogeneic transplant. So I think conditioning hasn't been extremely important for changing bone marrow transplantation, except for the non-myeloablative and reduced intensity when you combine with autologous. But the difference in outcome, if you use sulfan or total body irradiation, as far as I know, is not dramatic. There's no clear difference, actually. So I think the post-treatment was more important for better outcome, the post-treatment, post-transplant supportive treatment, than the conditioning per se was more, except for the for reducing the conditioning intensity. That was, of course, very important for many disorders, not for all.
And in that time, the Karolinska Institute was the only transplant center in Sweden, or were there foundations of other transplantation wards during that time?
No, it was only at that time. It was only at the Karolinska Institute, but very soon, I cannot tell exactly when the other centers came along, but they probably started in the 90s in Lund, in Uppsala, in Gothenburg, and even in Linköping, they made a few transplants. I don't know whether they have continued. In Umeå, they only made autologous transplants. So there are other centers that started successively in fact, in the late 80s and 90s. Mm-hmm. So, but from the beginning, it was only the Karolinska Institute, Karolinska Hospital, rather. You know, Karolinska Institute is the university, and the Karolinska Hospital, and they have different administrations. It's difficult to understand for people outside, but they are different, but they are more or less, they collaborate. So, for example, I have my office at Huddinge Hospital, Karolinska Hospital, Huddinge is called now. But I belong to the Karolinska Institute. So mixed administrations, but separate administrations, but mixed anyway. You know, and this has been important in the Macchiarini affair, because was it the hospital that was responsible for the failures, or was it Karolinska Institute? And that's still debated, you know, it's not clear.
And when did you enter the Nobel Prize Assembly Committee? When was that?
I entered the Nobel Assembly and the committee in 1987.
87, okay.
And then I retired in 1997. So it was a 10-year period. So okay. I was all the time in both. So I never was only in the assembly. In the beginning, I was an associate in the committee. That was why I could sit for 10 years. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been possible for more than 2 times 3, that's 6 years. Okay. So that was a gain situation, you know, to enter as an associate, but then you could sit longer.
Yeah. Maybe I would like to come to the EBMT now, because that was
okay.
Yeah. Now I've never tried to capture it that way, but you said before that the EBMT was founded in 1975. You said.
Yes.
And that's right. But during that time there were not that many transplants performed in Europe. So
really not.
How did that come to foundation?
Yeah. You know, I was not among those who started the EBMT. I just want to point out that from the beginning. So I don't know exactly how they reasoned, But John van Rod, he was actually an immunologist in the Netherlands. He was very active in starting this. And then there was in Basel, they had started transplants very early. And it was Bruno Speck. He was at that time head of the hematology unit in Basel. And Bruno Speck, he made some of the very early transplants, particularly in chronic myelocytic leukemia. I heard him in a meeting where he had done several transplants in chronic myelocytic leukemia, but at the late stage of the disease, and results were very poor. So he didn't succeed very well at that time, but he built up in the 70s a unit for bone marrow transplantation. So he had started already late 60s, early 70s. So I think he was actually one of the key players there, John van Rod and Bruno Speck. But then also at Hôpital Saint-Louis, from where George Maté came, in fact, there was Elian Gluckman. And Elian Gluckman, very good person and have done many. She was the one who started cord blood transplantation later on at Hôpital Saint-Louis in Paris. And she was pupil of Jean Bernard again, the same as George Maté, was also pupil of Jean Bernard. But Elian Gluckman continued when George Maté left. She was younger than George Maté. She had done in the 60s transplants at Hôpital Saint-Louis. So these three people, there might have been, I'm not sure about John Goldman, whether he was there from the beginning. John Goldman was at that time working at Hammersmith Hospital. He was not the head of the hematology unit at that time, but he was interested in bone marrow transplant, particularly in chronic myelocytic leukemia. So I'm not sure if he was among these persons, but it was Bruno Speck, Elian Gluckman, and John van Rod. And John van Rod then added Ferry Swan. Ferry Swan has not been very well known later on, but he became the secretary of the EBMT. He was the first secretary of EBMT. And he actually was the one, in my opinion, who started to build up the registry and the first patients. And he launched the paper stuff that should be filled in to be reported to the registry, which was created in Leiden, where it still is. So these people, in my opinion, were the one who started EBMT. So Bruno Speck became the president and Ferry Swan became the secretary. And so they started to join once a year in the Alps. And the idea was that you would work in the morning, ski in the middle of the day, and work in the evening. And I got to know about this 1975. So I talked with my friend called Gösta Gahrton, the transplant surgeon, and I said that we should, of course, be members of this establishment, the EBMT, the society, whatever you call it, the working group was it from the beginning. And so we contacted these people and we were welcome. And so we became a center that participated in this. That was, at that time, I don't remember about any bylaws or any constitution or anything like that. We just met. And the first time I was at an EBMT meeting was in the late 1970s. I'm not sure it was 79 or 77 or something like that, in a place in the Alps that was called Sils Maria. It was in Switzerland because, of course, Bruno Speck, he was from Basel, and Switzerland was a place where we went. And how many were we? We were, in fact, 70 people at that time. So it had expanded a little, you know.
Mm.
And we were at a pension, a very nice one. We could all have rooms at that little pension. And then maybe there was some other Swiss people that were added. So the center core was probably only about 50 or something like that. And the key players there was John van Rod. It was a guy who would call Hobbs from UK. He was not among the founders, but he was very active in bone marrow transplantation. And it was a guy from Hammersmith, Ted Gordon Smith, who was in their plastic anemia business, and he had made transplant in aplastic anemia. Hobbs made transplants in genetic disorders in children. And John van Rod, of course, was not a clinical person, but he was in the immune. He was actually proposed for the Nobel Prize several times because together with Dosset, who got the prize for the HLA system in 1980 already. But John never made it. I cannot tell why. He didn't get the prize, but he was very, very, very active in EBMT. So that was how I met these people, and I made a presentation there. Right, and then, of course, then we had skiing, and then we met each other in the evenings and so forth. And the following years, of course, everything expanded slowly. And there were more and more presentations, you know, and EBMT expanded. I had a picture once of how it expanded, but I don't have it anymore. But anyhow, eventually we became too many to meet in the Alps and go skiing. And one day, John Goldman, who was a big player in EBMT during many years, he had not been the president at that time. He asked me, he said, Gösta, do you want to be the president of EBMT? And I said, well, I'm not well known in EBMT yet, but why don't you try to be president yourself? And you no, I said, no, not yet, or something like that. And then, in fact, he probably lobbied. I don't know how he did it. But the next year, I was proposed to be president of EBMT. And in 1988, I became president. And at that time, one guy who was very important earlier, I don't know when he entered, I don't think he was one of the founders. That was Peter Ernst. And he was from Denmark and from Copenhagen. And he had started transplants very early to give, together with his boss, who was called Sven Killman. And Killman had worked in Brookhaven with a guy called Eugene Cronkite, who was very important in studying how cells went around in the body, particularly the neutrophils. And he had labeled them and so forth. No details about that. But anyhow, Killman, pupil Ernst, became the treasurer of EBMT. And he was treasurer already before me. And before me, a guy called Alberto Marmon from Genoa. He was like a field marshal, a tall person, very nice person. So he looked like a field marshal, but he was not a very good administrator. So, you know, EBMT was still, I would say, not very much depending on a constitution. There was one, but it was not very good, I would say. We met, we had we were still meeting in the Alps, and my mom was president and Congress president in the Courmayeur, close to part of Mont Blanc, I would say, not far from Chamonix. I think that was one of the last meetings we could have in the Alps, because then actually EBMT just expanded. So Alberto would step down as president, and I became the president following Alberto Marmont. And I found out that there was actually no organization to speak about, no constitution that was valuable, and so on. So together with Peter Ernst, I started to redo the constitution of EBMT. Maybe that was my most important contribution to EBMT, because I think still there are some signs of the old constitution, although it has been rewritten several times since then. But Peter and I worked very hard with that. So we built the constitution on the centers, and it's still built on the centers. So center membership is a relatively unique thing for EBMT. Then, of course, you are an individual member as well, but it is a center that they actually elect. At least it was that until recently. I don't know whether they've changed it now, but it was the centers that were the key bodies of EBMT. So that was what we did. And then we actually planned to have a EBMT meeting in Stockholm. And since I had rewritten the constitution at that time, it was only a 2-year mandate to be the president. And I thought that that was too short time. So now it is I think if it's not been changed, it's 2 times 2 years. That's 4 years for the president usually. And although I then had the possibility to sit for another 2 years, I thought that since I had changed to a longer period of time, I should not sit this period myself. I was there only for 2 years, so I stepped down in 1990. And that meant that we had to have a new president. And whom did you think I would suggest? Well, I suggested, of course, John Goldman, who had suggested me before that time. And at that time, John didn't say no. So he became the first president that could sit for 4 years. And he became president in 1990. And therefore, I was not the president when we had the meeting in Stockholm in 1992. But I became the Congress president, and John was the president of EBMT. So the meeting, the EBMT meeting in Stockholm in 1992 was arranged by myself and Per Ljungman, who then had stepped up as an important player in my department and started to take care of many of the patients with that were transplanted. He became the transplanter at the Huddinge Hospital. The Karolinska Hospital is not now called, because Huddinge merged with the Solna, so it's now one hospital. So that was, and that meeting, I think we were some 1,500 people at that meeting. So EBMT had really expanded at that time. And maybe I exaggerate a little, but anyway, it was expanding enormously. And I mean, then you have seen the enormous expansion. I have a little anecdote for my entering as president. Before me and before Marmont, in fact, Ted Gordon Smith from Hammersmith had been the president. And in my opinion, he had not done very much for EBMT or to expand it or anything like that. But then I asked Ted Gordon Smith when I was elected, I said, what do you think I should do? What is the most important for me to act on for EBMT. He said, you should do as little as possible, then it will expand by itself. So that was the message that I did not accept, you know. But that was maybe he was right at his time, but you know, because it expanded nevertheless. But Ted was a very nice person. We had good relations, but he had a little different a philosophy that was a little different from my own. So anyway, this was in 1998. So well, that I think is as much as I can tell about EBMT. If you have not other questions.
What did you talk about during these early meetings? Did you try to establish studies, or did you just share experiences from your first patients, or?
Well, of course, the registry was enormously important, you know, it was one. But what I did, I think that is my main contribution. I, in fact, started the first randomized or actually study based on the availability of an compatible donor in multiple myeloma and EBMT. So that was going on, you know, as you might have seen for many, many years. The study where we made allogeneic transplants with reduced intensity conditioning in multiple myeloma patients. It was the first study in EBMT. They hadn't had randomized or based on availability of donors. But before that, I told you about the registry. The transplants in myeloma became very important, in fact. So the first article was published in New England Journal of Medicine, allogeneic transplantation of multiple myeloma in 1990, I think, or 1993. Now I have forgotten the exact date. So we made an EBMT study published in New England Journal of Medicine when we had a relatively large material. And the thing that we showed was first what's now talked about a lot, and that is the importance of obtaining complete remission. Because those who obtain complete remission, perhaps you could expect it, but we showed it very clearly, were more frequently cured or long-term survivors. Maybe you should say that instead. So that was one of the big contributions, I think. And we published new data on that in Journal of Clinical Oncology also, and that was also registry studies. So the registry studies were very important. So, and after that, I started this prospective study that has been published and republished in both Journal of Clinical Oncology and Blood. So I think my main contribution to EBMT studies was actually in myeloma. That was, and it was first registry studies, and then eventually, when we had reduced intensity, it became this prospective study, because the early ones were not based on non-reduced intensity. It was full conditioning with 10 gray and lung chilling. So that is the answer to my contribution to EBMT studies. And I think that's it. I haven't done much more than that.
And during the 80s, did you, because the registry already existed, so you filled
Yes.
in the paperwork and sent it to the EBMT office to Leiden?
Yes.
Or?
Oh, yes. It was always, Leiden was always, Simona Jacobelli. She was extremely important, and she's still there, you know. Mm. And she was important from the beginning in this study. In the earlier studies, I had a statistician myself, in fact, who was doing quite of the job. But Leiden was the key place for both the registry studies and for this prospective study. And Simona Jacobelli, I rate her very highly. She's very good. She's still very good, you know. And she was at that time, and she was the one who done all the statistics. Now there are other players involved, of course, but she was a key person.
But when you now look back to 1990 and then onwards during the 90s, what do you think? Because you retired in 1997, you said?
Yeah, I retired formally, but I was still working, of course.
Well,
So when we started in 2000, this prospective study, I was formally retired, in fact. So I worked then, of course, with the EBMT study, and I worked, but I was not in charge of the patients myself at that time. But since I had been the head of our department, I still could more or less do this with the help of others, Per Ljungman and Olle Rindén, and these people were also involved, of course, but EBMT in particular. So it was Bo Björkstrand was working with me at that time. In fact, he was the first author on the first publication in Journal of Clinical Oncology. And then I wrote the follow-up in Blood. But I started it. I wrote the whole program from the beginning for the prospective study.
And what would you think, when you look back, what are the key steps after 1990 for allogenic transplant to make it that more applicable to more patients? What did you experience? What were the key the milestones you experienced in the clinic?
Think there are several milestones, and I haven't thought them very well, but I think one milestone was, of course, the use of unrelated donors. That was an enormous milestone. And I mean, all these registries, registries for donor registries that were built up. Very much John van Rode again, important for this. And then the world, the WMDA, you know, was important for this. And John van Rode made first this book, you know, where you could search for donors, and then it was totally computerized for finding a donor. I mean, I don't know how many donors I have now, 25 million or something like that, or potential donors. Then, of course, the haploidentical was a really breakthrough. And what that means for the registries, I don't know. But it could be that the registry of donors, the donor registries. The question is, how frequently will you use an unrelated donor? I know it's used a lot, but with a better result with haplo, there could be a change. I don't know whether you can see it already, but I wouldn't be surprised if there will be less use of unrelated donors when you can use haploidentical transplants. And another important, so if we jump a little earlier, I think a very important breakthrough was the use of peripheral blood stem cells. And when you went from bone marrow to peripheral blood stem cells, and you could see that it was actually as good. I mean, I don't know whether still it's true that you have somewhat more graft-versus-host disease with peripheral blood. There was some works in the beginning of that. But I mean, I don't know if bone marrow is used at all anymore. It's used for some children or something like that, where it seems to be better. But otherwise, peripheral blood stem cells are totally dominating the cells, the stem cell that you use. So
how did that come into play? How was that discovered that you can use?
Yeah, that is a good question. I should have digged it up. Who was a key person for?
Or when did you use your first peripheral blood?
We used it already in the 1990s. So the prospective study was entirely based on peripheral blood stem cells. While the earlier studies were with bone marrow, the registry studies were mainly with bone marrow. I'm not sure how much Bill Benzinger was using. That was a French group that used peripheral blood stem cells very early. I've forgotten the name of the guy who was there. John Goldman also used peripheral blood stem cells relatively early. But the key person there, I think there were parallel starts of using peripheral blood stem cells. So, but that could, of course, be checked exactly who was the key player there.
And when do you remember your first peripheral blood transplant?
I don't know. I don't remember exactly, because I'm not sure that we thought it was such an enormous change, but of course it was. So, but I would suspect it was in the 90s, somewhere in the 90s. It could be earlier, but that's as far as I remember.
Yeah.
Peripheral blood stem, I mean, it's exactly as good as bone marrow. It's easier and all that. I mean, I remember often in the beginning when we used bone marrow, the first transplants we made, me and the surgeon, Carl Gustav Groth, we were standing for 4 hours in the operating theater to get marrow. Many of you, maybe you don't even remember that, but that was how it was. So it was a big step when we could use peripheral blood stem cells. I didn't need to use the operating theater. For an internist like myself to enter the operating theater at Huddinge Hospital, I needed the surgeon, Carl Gustav Groth, to enter there. All the nurses, they were suspicious. And so when the peripheral blood stem cell came, that was, really good. We didn't have to enter the operating theater anymore. Maybe that was not the most important for peripheral blood stem cells, but it was, of course, very much easier and practical and all that.
And
but I have to look it up who should be credited.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about it. I'm really not sure. I know there's a French guy who I met several times who in some way claimed that he was probably the first one. And I have forgotten his name. That's a pity.
But I think what's quite interesting, because when you often said now that it was a change, but we thought in that moment we didn't really acknowledge it as such a change, because it seemed it was easier. It was it relieved a lot of management, etc. But I think when we look now, when we learn things and we look back, and we always think as because we haven't been there and we haven't done things like that for now. Sometimes one overestimates the steps instead of when you're in the moment, you just do it.
You are right. I mean, although I claim that it was a big change, because it was a big change to use peripheral blood stem cells, of course, it wasn't as dramatic because, as you see, I don't remember exactly the first patient. So in a way, the procedure of giving it back was the same. It was just that recovering the cells was different. And this, of course, since this was done at the transfusion unit, they recovered the peripheral blood stem cells. We didn't do it ourselves, in fact. We took the bone marrow when I had already left taking out bone marrow. Younger doctors did that at the end, So therefore, the change for me to peripheral blood stem cells, I didn't notice this very clearly when it happened, because you infuse the cells in exactly the same way as you had done before with the bone marrow.
Yeah.
So maybe that's the reason I don't exactly remember the first patient. And secondly, that I have forgotten who was a key player in inventing and showing that it was possible.
So when you look all the way back, what do you think? Where is transplant now, with all the changes that happened during the past, all the minimal changes we cannot discuss here, I guess. But what do you think when you look back? What's the place for allogeneic transplant now?
Yeah, that is really good question, and it's not so easy to answer anymore because of this new thing with CAR T cells, antibodies, and all that. How will it change allogeneic transplant? Well, I speculated together with Stefan Mielke some time ago, what will happen to allogeneic transplant in light of using CAR T cells, for example? And for myeloma, which is my interest, I could think about using CAR T cells and being followed by an allogeneic transplant. Many people would not agree on that at all. But the reason I think in those terms is that we still don't cure multiple myeloma. And we know that if we have a good remission, the results are very good in comparison when you use in other situations. And with CAR T cells, you get fabulous remissions, but they recover in 1 year. Most of the patients have relapses. And I think for the foreseeable time, you can neither use CAR T cells up front or use allogeneic transplant up front. But in these kind of patients where you, after relapse, get fabulous remissions with CAR T cells, but know that you will have early relapses, most probably, maybe allogeneic transplantation could be a method for some patients, at least those with very poor prognostic factors. Because we have just gone through our material on autologous transplantation in patients, and you may have data on that as well, in patients with high-risk markers, that we have not improved very much on those patients over the last 10 or 20 years, while improvement is on standard risk patients. So there might be some place in myeloma. For other disorders, well, of course, I wouldn't be surprised if new drugs in acute leukemia and in many other disorders where we do allogeneic transplants may be competitors to the use of allogeneic transplant, as has been the case in myeloma. So that could mean some kind of decline in the numbers. But I'm not certain. I think it will still be an important method, but indications will change.
But one time you said that if we, for instance, because just for the rationale for the therapy, one could say, as you said, that that newer drugs or newer cellular therapies are not for cure. They are immunotherapies, but they do not really aim for cure mechanistically. And that's what the transplant does, right? That's what I understood.
Yeah, well, I cannot claim that the drugs do not aim for cure, but in myeloma, they have not been very successful for cure. That's for clear. In acute leukemia, of course, you have many drugs that are very good and may cure, and even in chronic myelocytic leukemia, I mean, there the new drugs are very good and you don't perform many allogeneic transplants in chronic myelocytic leukemia anymore. I mean, the place which I thought when I was younger was really where we cured patients that we couldn't do otherwise. So it still is, it's very difficult to predict that we will not have curable drugs in many other cancers. We could very well have that. And if we get that, then of course, allogeneic transplant may be less needed, no doubt, I think. But usually you find new indications, so I cannot predict which ones. I mean, genetic disorders, well, there may be is a place. But if we take, for example, Gaucher's disease, we made the first, I think we made the first transplant, one of the first transplants in Gaucher's disease, which was very successful. And we make altogether 7 transplants in this very unusual disorder, Gaucher's disease, inherited disorder. But then came the enzyme. And the pediatricians, when the enzyme was there, they said, no way, we will not do allogeneic transplants. These patients, you don't cure the genetic defect, but the patients are living with their genetic defect, they get the enzyme, and that's enough for them. Although the cost is, I don't know, $100,000 or $200,000 a year or something like that. Transplant is cheaper, but still it's not done. So drugs will compete very much, even in genetic disorders.
Yeah, even
and then gene therapy. Maybe we'll come to gene therapy there.
Yeah.
And if that is done by cells or not, I don't know. But gene therapy, that's another story. I mean, we have in some immune deficiency disease very good results with gene therapy that could compete with allogeneic transplant.
What is quite a coincidence, because when our interview was broken, I got an alert that the Nobel Prize for Chemistry is received by the 2 women who invented CRISPR-Cas system. And that's another big point for gene therapy.
Yeah, absolutely. I had predicted that CRISPR-Cas would get the prize, in fact, to my wife. so that was, I mean, that was a fabulous discovery. You make CRISPR-Cas, no doubt, and that could have changed the gene therapy story a lot.
Yeah.
So you're absolutely right.
Maybe just one question to your specialty, myeloma. When you said you described your first experience with transplant in the 80s, and now you see this since like 10-15 years, this enormous improvement of myeloma outcome, myeloma patients' progression-free survival, overall survival. What do you think? Where is that heading?
Where do you mean where transplant is heading, or where drugs?
The whole thing, because sometimes some people just follow, let's say, the drugs, the new inventions, and try to do as many studies as possible. But to be a bit provocative for a young physician who tries to get around this disease and who tries to understand it, it's sometimes when you go to webinars now, or last year to presentations, educational presentations, there was this overflow of opportunities. You can provide the patient with that drug. You can offer him another option. Alternatives are always around the corner. But sometimes, maybe with your experience, sometimes one asks, okay, but what do I tell the patient? Yeah, let's try this, and if that doesn't work, we try another one. But what is the rationale? And the rationale for transplants is always, I think, or what I understood, is quite the same. You try to transplant him and then try to cure him, see what happens. With drugs, that's not the case. You try to, yeah, hope for the best.
Well, maybe that it's one treatment method now will disappear. It's one treatment method against another one, and I would not be surprised if we find drugs that eventually do the same as a chronic myelocytic leukemia with myeloma. It could happen. And I think that the CAR T cells, that was new, no doubt about that. It turned out that patients relapses later on, and it doesn't really fit the concept that if you get a complete remission, then you will, in my opinion, it doesn't really seem to be the case. I don't know yet, but they seem to relapse relatively early, despite the fact that you get a molecular remission. So you don't really know. That drugs may be added at that point instead of what I suggested, an allogeneic transplant, and then maybe then the drugs will be more sustainable. And of course, I wouldn't be surprised if CAR T, or what I'm now more anxious to test, that is CAR NK, which will come because we deal with NK cells now, will be made much early in the course of the disease. And it will compete with the allogeneic transplants. And either that will mean that you will not do it at all, as it seems now, or that it will revitalize because you can perform an allogeneic transplant at remission after an CAR NK cell treatment or T cell treatment. It's very difficult. I don't think I can predict it. It's too difficult. But perhaps, unfortunate for an allogeneic transplanter, it still means that we'll perform less allogeneic transplants with the drugs coming up, yeah, and the CAR T cells and all that. It is possible.
It's unfortunate, but in general, it's a good sign that we are doing progress in the disease and we can help more patients.
Absolutely.
So my question was just provocative to get you to.
Are you all allogeneic?
Yeah.
Well, that's I mean, even if we are bone marrow transplanters, we should not be so narrow-sighted that we cannot accept that at some point, better method than it think about the disease is abusive. Yeah. I like allogeneic transplants because I've seen so many good things with it, but I'm open for competitors, and they might be better in the long run.
Yeah.
I have to accept that. But you can read my last overview in Journal of Clinical Medicine together with Stefan and all those, maybe I've seen it, where I still, and Luciano Costa, by the way, he studies very good, you know, that perhaps we still should do some allogeneic transplants in myeloma.
Yeah. What are your next plans? So you're retired now for quite a while, but you're still active?
Yeah, you know, now I will not start the new study of my own. I think soon, 88 years old, it's a little late in my career. But in fact, I have a couple of studies that the young people, I call it my pupils nowadays, have done, and I help them in writing, and I rewrite some of their papers and try to make them better. And they don't deal with allogeneic transplants. Usually they deal with autologous transplant and myeloma. But it is about myeloma patients. And I will continue with that and help these young people that I work with that are very enthusiastic. And I think it is very nice to work with them. And they have good ideas, you know, and they are, I think, well in the front of the science in particular myeloma that they still do.
Great. So yeah, I wanna be that active with 88 as well, hopefully.
Okay, you will. I'm sure you will. You have done many interesting studies that I have heard before, so I'm sure about that.
So if you don't have anything to add, I think we can finish here. It was a really nice talk.
Wonderful. We can do that, and then we skip the Monday. We don't need any more.
Yeah,
is that right?
I think we did. If you want to add something, you can call me or text me, whatever you want.
No, it's fine. I think it's fine. Perfect. I think I'm very happy. It was nice to talk with you, Nico, and I wish you a wonderful time and future, and I'm sure you will do important science.
Yeah, we hopefully see each other next year, but I think
yes,
EBMT
absolutely.
meeting will, I don't know whether it will happen in person, but yeah, let's see.
Let's see.